As I mentioned in my last video, recently I've been doing a lot of the PortSwigger Web Security Academy labs, and I wanted to continue that in this video. But in this video, I specifically wanted to cover a topic that I feel like doesn't really get talked about enough, and that is business logic vulnerabilities. I feel like pen testers and bug bounty hunters, and pretty much anyone who really considers themselves a hacker or anything similar to that, a lot of time we're looking for those really deep technical things where we can kind of like show off our hacker skills. But a lot of times in reality, a lot of the biggest vulnerabilities and the types of things that can be the most impactful for a business are things related to business logic. And some of these can just be very basic things, like giving too much trust to the user or making assumptions about who a user is or how they would use the application. But some of these very simple, basic flaws in the business logic of an application can actually lead to very high severity risks and vulnerabilities that can lose a company lots and lots of money. So like I said in the last video, I'm trying to get through all of the apprentice labs in the Web Security Academy because I really want to get that newbie tag off of my profile. And the only way to do that is to solve all 50 plus of these apprentice rated labs in the Academy. So I'm going to start with this first one, the excessive trust in client-side controls lab. Since this is the very first lab in the business logic topic, I'm not expecting it to be too difficult, but I am going to try to do a second lab in this same video. So hopefully if you stay tuned to the second half, the next lab will be a little more challenging. So to read the instructions, it says this lab doesn't adequately validate user input. You can exploit a logic flaw in its purchasing workflow to buy items for an unintended price. To solve the lab, buy a lightweight lead leather jacket. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open this lab, and I'm also going to go ahead and launch Burp Suite. Once both of those launch, I'm going to open a browser inside my Burp Suite session and copy and paste the URL to that lab in that browser. So I already logged in with the credentials that they gave us in the instructions, and the instructions said we need to purchase this lightweight lead leather jacket for an unintended price. So let's take a look at it, and we'll see that it is $1,337. Naturally. And when we add it to our cart, we see it there, and we only have $100, so we can't afford it. But let's try placing an order anyway, just so we can take a look at what that workflow looks like. So obviously we do not have enough credit for this purchase. So when we look through that workflow, we see here is this GET request where we took a look at that product. And then here's the post request when we added it to our cart. Then here's where we viewed our cart. And here's a post request where we tried to check out. But this request did not finish because we didn't have enough credits in our account. The request that looks most interesting to me though is this post request where we added it to our cart. And if we send this request to repeater, we can see that down in the parameters of the request, there's a product ID, there's a redirect, there's a quantity, and there's also a price. So the fact that they are sending a price with the request where you're actually adding it to the cart, that makes me think that we can probably change this parameter and maybe get it to give us a different price when it ends up in our cart. So let's try changing it instead of 1,337. Let's try changing it to an even $1,000 and see what happens. Follow redirection. I don't see any errors or anything here, but let's go back to our cart and refresh it and see if we see a new item in our cart. We see it. Okay, so the price has been changed to $1,000. And since we only have $100 credit in our account, let's knock a zero off that to make it even 100. Send that request, refresh our cart, and now we have it in our cart for $100. Of course, that gives us 3 in our cart, and we don't want to buy 3, we only buy 1 because we're not greedy. So I'm actually going to remove all 3 of these. So now we have an empty cart, and I'm going to send this request again and follow redirection. And now I'm going to refresh my cart again. And now I have 1 lightweight lead leather jacket for $100 in my cart, and I'm going to place order. Your order is on the way, and congratulations, you solved the lab. So like I said, this was not expected to be difficult. This was only the first lab in the business logic vulnerabilities section, and most of the time the first lab is usually pretty simple and just going to give you sort of an introduction to what kind of vulnerabilities you're dealing with. And this was just a very simple business logic flaw where they were submitting a parameter in a post request that didn't need to be sent. Obviously, there's going to be a database with all those products in the shop, and they're all going to have prices and product IDs and all that information about those products in the database. So it's not necessary to send the price with that information when you're sending it to your cart. But somewhere along the way, someone made a mistake and they decided that whenever you send something to your cart, I'm going to go to the database and grab all that information, the product ID, the name of the product, and the price, and I'm going to send all of that in the post request. Obviously, this is a very extreme example, and you probably won't see something this bad and this obvious in the wild, but basic logic flaws like this happen all the time. And like I said at the beginning, I wanted to go over 2 of these labs to kind of give you some examples of some different types of logic vulnerabilities you might find. So this one is called Inconsistent Security Controls. And the instructions say this lab's flawed logic allows arbitrary users to access administrative functionality that should only be available to company employees. To solve the lab, access the admin panel and delete the user Carlos. So once again, I'm going to access the lab. And again, I'm going to copy and paste that URL into the browser inside my burp session. So the instructions said that this app has some admin functionality that you're not supposed to be able to access. So in order to find this admin section of the app, you would probably want to use some sort of fuzzer like GoBuster or something in order to map the site and find any sort of directories that you don't know about. And Burp Suite Pro actually has a discover content function that you can use to do this without using a different tool like GoBuster or anything like that. But for this lab, I am only using the community edition, which is free, and this version doesn't have those engagement tools available. So if I was on a real engagement trying to do a pen test or something on this application, I would actually go through something like GoBuster or using Burp Suite Pro using that Discover Content tool. But because this is just a lab, I have an inkling that is probably going to be pretty easy to find. So I'm just going to try to go to /admin and see if that happens to bring me to an admin portal. And it does. So I got a bit lucky there, but honestly, this is not that unusual. A lot of websites will have a /admin portal. But now that we have found this /admin portal, we see that it says admin interface only available if logged in as a don't want to cry user. So clearly there is some sort of logic happening here where it checks if you are a proper user in order to access this admin portion. But right now we don't have an account at all, so obviously we can't be a don't want to cry user either. So I'm going to go to register and see about trying to make an account. So it says here, if you work for Don't Want to Cry, please use your @don'twantacry.com email address. So I don't work for Don't Want to Cry, so I'm just going to make a regular user using a regular email address. And for this lab, they give us an email client. So if I go to that email client, they have this email address that I can use for our purposes in this lab. So I'm just going to paste that into that email field and I'm going to click register. So it says, please check your emails for your account registration link. Refresh the inbox and we get this link. I'm going to click that. And account registration successful. Okay, so now we have an account. And if we go to the login page and try to log in with our new account, we see that we have an account that is working and it tells us what our email address. And the only thing that this little app lets us do is change our email address. And just to verify again, I'm going to try going to /admin. And again, it says you are not logged in as a Don't Want to Cry user, so you don't have access to it. But if we remember back when we looked at that registration form, it says that if you are a Don't Want to Cry employee, use an @don'twantacry email address. So what happens if we just update our email address to an @don'twantacry.com email? We update our email address. They don't have any sort of verification where they make sure that that is your email address when you change it. So now, as far as they know, attacker@don'twantacry.com is my actual email address, even though I don't have any access to that email address at all. But you may have noticed that after I changed that email address, a new button popped up over here in the top right corner. I now have access to an admin panel. So if I click on that, I have access to the admin panel and I can delete users. And our goal was to delete Carlos, so delete. User deleted successfully. Congratulations, you solved the lab. So again, this was not a super complex lab. It is just sort of demonstrating some basic types of business logic flaws. This is one where they were doing some sort of verification to make sure that you had a proper email address in order to access the admin portion. But the only thing they were doing to actually verify this was take a look at the domain of your email address. So if you had some sort of email address @don'twantacry.com, it said, okay, well, you have a Don't Want to Cry email address, so you obviously have access to admin. And in addition to that, they also didn't have any sort of verification when you changed your email address on your account. So if they were handling everything properly, when you changed your email address in your account settings, it would have sent an email to that email address and you would have had to click on a link or enter a code or something to verify that you do have actual access to that email address. And in addition to that, they would have been doing some sort of verification in like a database or something to make sure that your email address actually should have access to that admin instead of just looking at the @don'twantacry.com part. And I know that these seem very simple and basic types of labs that aren't really that realistic, but I've actually seen sort of similar issues like this in apps that I've tested as part of my day job. I've seen apps that when you change your email address, they don't do any sort of verification to make sure you have access to that email address. And I've also seen apps that just do like a string comparison to make sure you are who you say you are, instead of actually verifying that that real user does exist and should have access to what it's accessing. But I hope this was interesting or useful to you. I know business logic flaws aren't exactly like the coolest, most interesting types of hacks. If you're like an up-and-coming hacker, you're probably wanting to do exploits and buffer overflows and all those really cool hacks where you can be typing on a terminal and see like green text fly across the screen. All that kind of stuff looks cool in movies, but you also need to be able to find these business logic flaws, because at the end of the day, this is the kind of stuff that your client is going to want to know about. And if you're interested in checking out any more of these PortSwigger Web Security Academy labs, check out this video over here where I looked at a couple labs dealing with bypassing two-factor authentication.